What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was neglected, but wielded the chakra of every dead Hokage? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. It had been a week since the loss of the Uchiha clan. During that week, the academy had been temporarily suspended. Many funerals were held within a short span of time, and people were still grieving upon the, unknowingly traitorous, Uchiha's graves. Life in Konoha took a pause when the incident was partially revealed to the public. That they had been massacred. Now, however, life was steadily becoming normal again. The academy and civilian schools had resumed, and most people went about their daily lives. Two Uchihas in particular hit Naruto's classroom hard with their deaths. Sasuke and Miki Uchiha, the only ones in their class. Naruto hadn't really ever conversated with either, so all he knew about them was what he had picked up in passing. Miki was a rather clumsy and exuberant orange-haired girl, daughter of two civilian Uchihas. Yes, those exist. And next, Sasuke, a hard-working, yet very privileged raven-haired boy. One of the two sons of the clan head. After their deaths had been confirmed, however, Naruto could remember something good about one of them. It was that Sasuke Uchiha had always kicked his ass in taijutsu. Without fail, every single time, and only progressively got worse each time they sparred. Never had he challenged the raven-haired boy, but he always seemed to end up sparring with him at the end of the thrice-weekly physical practice tests. Damn pond scum. Flashback. Week 2 of the academy. The only children who really knew how to fight were from clans. So why am I picked to fight one? Does the instructor want to make me the designated laughing stock right off the bat? Naruto wondered with annoyance. Seeing the look the man gave him, it pretty much confirmed it. Without a doubt, he mumbled. Sighing, the fur-capped blonde stepped up to the circle. It was a little over 2 meters in diameter. If you got knocked out of the circle, one loss, and vice versa. Naruto noticed Sasuke appraising him, as if wondering if the blonde would be a challenge. Probably not, the hat-wearing boy thought, negatively. He didn't really know jack worth forms, or styles other than the very basics to improve upon on their own time. The odds were so tipped out of favor for him it was almost hilarious. The instructor signaled them to get ready. Naruto got into the basic stance they had been taught in the week prior. Legs balanced but ready to move forward or backward and either hand ready to attack or guard. Sasuke, on the other hand, got in a counter stance, the interception fist, if he could recall the name correctly. Ready? The green-haired instructor asked, and the boys both nodded. Naruto slightly glaring at the man, who totally ignored him. Hajime. At first Naruto thought that Sasuke would move forward, given that he lurched. It was a lure, he quickly figured out. Sasuke danced around the side of the white ring, until he got into Naruto's space. This was admittedly a bad move on the raven-haired boy's part, as he was forced to avoid a bastardized sweep kick by stepping into the middle of the ring. Naruto stepped forward and dug his heel into the ground, attempting another kick, this time high. Instead of dodging, Sasuke caught the shin and pushed back. This resulted in Naruto going off balance, and barely catching himself before he fell out of bounds. Sasuke went in for the offense, throwing a punch that Naruto barely dodged by stepping in and to the side. He threw an elbow towards the Uchiha, who was forced back. Naruto went for the offense again this time, and a fist landed. Sasuke winced, but didn't move his position, he took the hit on purpose. Too busy with avoiding getting his teeth removed by alternative means, Naruto stepped back and away from Sasuke's own elbow. Bad move. Sasuke took advantage of the lack of distance. Naruto had his right ankle jabbed, which hurt like a bitch by the way, by his opponent's sandal. He caught himself quickly. However, Naruto slipped up. It all happened so fast. His foot landed a quarter over the boundary line. Sasuke wins. Loser. Naruto. The moss-headed instructor was all too happy to shout to the other students, of most who proceeded to cheer for the darker-haired boy. Naturo's fingers twitched with annoyance. He never shouted out the losers for any other match. Damn green-haired pond scum. Flashback end. Even though he didn't think of the boy as a friend, he still missed the challenge that came with sparring with him. Naruto personally thought that he was never great at taijutsu, but even then, he found himself besting most of the other kids in his class. The only people who ever gave him trouble on the off chance he got to practice with them were In order of most difficult, Kiba Inuzuka, Choji Akamichi, and even Shino Aburame. Surprisingly enough, Naruto hadn't beat any of them yet. Also, he always thought that the Aburame almost exclusively used bug-based techniques. Maybe they were trying to train a less specialized member? The rest of his class consisted of other clan heirs, the Hyuga, Yamanaka, and Nara, with the rest being all civilians, or from pseudo-shinobi families such as Kamurasaki Amy. 1. He always got put with the far more rainbows and sunshine group of civilians when it came to spars, so beating them was not really a surprise. In the actual classroom is where he did slightly worse in some areas. Mostly world history. He really didn't see why people needed to know that Hashirama Senju's grandfather was the first known use of Mokuton, or that the kunai was first mass-produced over 1,000 years ago. This didn't help anyone or solve any problems. Essentially, useless information, but he didn't voice any displeasure as it wouldn't solve any problems for him. It might spontaneously produce more. Besides, it only lasted 3 days out of the week, Monday, Tuesday and Thursday. The only classes that he could truly say he was good at were survival, and the anatomy lessons, of which on the latter he was the top of the class. Naruto was also pretty good at bukajutsu, but none of the weapons they learned to use, kunai, shuriken, and ninja wire, really suited him. Not to say he didn't like the kunai, however. Versatile, just not quite him. He did hear that students could take one of a few electives in their second year and beyond, so that was nice. He was gonna go for either medical nin courses or the extra chakra control lessons. Both sounded far more useful to his tastes than the barrier ninjutsu lessons that a good amount of the civilian children were taking interest in order to stay in the village. Students. Naruto's violet blue eyes focused back on the world. He was seat number 36. The very back row, closest to the wall parallel to the windows. Talk about placement. We're getting a new teacher today, who was registered to help from day one, yet had some personal business to take care of, the moss-headed man, Fukuro-sensei announced. Come in. A shoulder-length silver-haired man stepped into the room, and Naruto's academy life instantly became more agonizingly annoying. The all smiles, fun and games, unless it came to Naruto, Mizuki Teme. Well, shit, say hello to your new teacher Namika Mizuki-sensei. While the others were greeted him, Naruto groaned into the table. It was going to be a long year. The academy released, and Naruto immediately made him way towards the Hokage tower. He was going to relive the minutes before horror struck. A terrible decision, no question. Originally, when he woke up from unconsciousness the morning after the massacre, he had thrown up. Not that there was anything to throw up. He hadn't eaten since nearly 15 hours prior. After a moment of mental failure and subsequent reboot, he had stayed silent for the remainder of the day. His only break from the silence were to the Hokage, asking what exactly he had seen. The reply: the world at its lowest. The words stayed with him, yet they didn't haunt him. While it wasn't supposed to get out to the public for a few days, it was inevitable that the people would question why no more Uchiha were around the village anymore. Why appointments that were made weren't followed through. Why utility and shop owners, workers never showed up to run their businesses or work their jobs. Dates that were made, cancelled, visiting of Uchiha friends, denied. All for the purpose of finding some way to get closure before the news was released. All the people involved knew it would happen. The Hokage, the shinobi sworn to secrecy, everyone. There was no way physically possible that they could keep it a secret. But they tried, and much to their surprise, it worked for the first day. When the news hit, it ignited the denizens of Konoha like a damn wildfire. The dominoes started to fall more like marbles spilling out of a bag. The Uchiha were murdered in an occult killing. A handful of people lost jobs, the economy temporarily dropped, the number of shinobi in the village was lower than after the Kyuubi attacked. So on and so forth. In short, the village was suffering from mental trauma. Amazingly so, though, it still held together well. And was getting back to its feet with a startling amount of energy, rebounding like a rubber ball. They were recovering. Konoha would never quite completely heal from the practical amputation of nearly a 1/6 of its shinobi part of the village. A very large part of the shinobi village. Well, not at least in this generation's lifetime, but they absolutely were coming back. Hashirama would be proud. However, this same effect was not had on Naruto, Sarutobi Hiruzen, or the Konoha Council, mostly Danzo. Naruto. Scarred from witnessing the horrible tragedy from his young age, Hiruzen, having to deal with the repercussions and problems the loss caused, and Danzo, losing any remnants of possible power he could have had. And the culprit, whose identity had yet to be revealed, was still out there. And unless they were suicidal too, they were alive. People wanted justice, and Naruto, being the only one to ever see the highly suspected female killer, had the memories to know who exactly it was. The only reason he hadn't been called in earlier was that the investigation team had only recently discovered two things. They ran through all of the findings they had, and came up with the possible gender of the killer and the likely age, both of which matched the person who Naruto had passed on the empty street. The evidence wasn't anywhere near solid, but they were grasping for straws. Naruto walked past the front desk attendant and up the winding stairs to the Hokage's office. He knocked on the door. "Enter," the third's voice called from behind the wooden door. Adjusting his side bag and hat, he pulled open the door and shuffled in, closing the doors behind once he had entered. Naruto bowed to the Hokage, and gave a nod of acknowledgement to Inoichi Yamanaka, the clan head of the Yamanaka, and best in his field. "Naruto, you know what you are here for, correct?" Hiruzen questioned the 8-year-old blonde, who nodded. "My memories." Naruto sighed lowly. Hiruzen nodded, then looked over to the other man. "Inoichi, are you prepared?" said Sandy. Blonde nodded, and motioned for Naruto to sit in the chair in front of himself. The fur-capped boy lifted his bag off, then sat down in the chair. "And the hat, if you will?" Inoichi asked, and Naruto obeyed, although slightly hesitant. Getting up and taking off his hat, revealing medium-length sunshine blonde hair, he set it gently on his bag. Naruto then sat back down on the chair. "Ready?" Naruto only nodded in response. Yamanaka's secret technique, mind walk. Naruto's mind. Both Naruto and Inoichi found themselves in a large room. The floor and ceiling was made of black brick, but the walls were so white that they couldn't tell if they actually existed or not. The only thing that told them that there was anything there were the red and blue pipes that ran along them. There was a giant red dot in the distance, or was it small and close? But Naruto couldn't make out what it was. The more he stared, it felt like the larger it got. "This is your mind. Everyone has their own unique setting. The memories will come much easier if you find it yourself. Reach out and travel to that point in time." An ethereal voice called to him. "Inoichi." Naruto closed his mind's eye and focused. He remembered the cool encroaching night air, the feeling of his feet touching the ground, him putting his little frog wallet away, then adjusting his hat. They were there. The street was clearer than the dusk night sky. He could only see his own line of vision, this also being true with Inoichi. He could count the milliseconds until the inevitable passing. He felt his head look up slightly. Then it happened. A flash of red and black so bright yet so short. And it was over. Nothing. His actual self had seen just as much as his memory self had. He hadn't really looked up at her. Just caught a glimpse of her dark brown hair. In other words, this was entirely useless. But it kept playing. He couldn't stop it. A short jump happened. He seemed to hit the fast forward button on the empty portion of walking. But when it slowed, all he could make out were the blood and symbols. The mutilated corpses, and the red-painted street. The bodies, 29 exactly, were in his view. They were all he could focus on. His automatic reaction was that he wanted to throw up again, but he couldn't. It was his mind. There wasn't even a body here to produce the vomit. It lasted for 4 minutes, 42 seconds. He hadn't even known that he stared at it for that long. But being forced to watch it for this long without phasing out, was sickening. Mind inject. Naruto's eyes shot open and his hand came up to cover his mouth. He keeled over to the floor, expecting to free the large amount of water he had drank from the fountain before he left the academy from his stomach. Nothing happened. No stomach convulsions or anything. The blonde heard the vague sound of stumbling behind him, but didn't turn. "Naruto!" The third called out to him, grabbing the blonde boy's shoulder. The Hokage looked up at the Yamanaka man. A shake of the head was his answer. They had found out. No, confirmed only one thing. This girl was undoubtedly an Uchiha. Flashback. Naruto walked out of the Hokage's office, and into the cool weather, his hat bill shadowing his thoughtful and philosophical expression. Much to his surprise, the scene was bearable this time. That did however did not mean he wanted to see it. Why did his mind automatically replay the last part? Was it because they were so close in time? Did they just link? But, you know what? Honestly, he didn't care. He still had a few rare nightmares about that moment, even now. So seeing it again wouldn't change much. Just this time, he was awake, and more liable to act upon ingrained human instinct. But he still found it difficult to swallow. That much death couldn't be simply ignored, could it? So then why did he feel that it shouldn't faze him very much? Would those thoughts make him a monster? In his opinion, both parts yes and no. Yes, because it was immoral. It was inhumane and a terrible mindset to have. He would never let himself fall so low as to just ignore death. He wasn't a completely sociopathic frenzy killer. Yet at the same time, no, because in reality, it was just blood. It was just punctured skin. Just markings on the ground. Right? As he had read in a book once. Humans were made up of 65% oxygen. What animals and people actually breathed, shocker, 18% carbon, trees, diamonds, etc. 10% hydrogen. The most abundant known element on Earth, 3% nitrogen, and 1.5% calcium, along with a whole host of a minuscule amount of other elements. So should logic come in front of human emotion? This debate was as old as science itself. Or was it philosophy? A debate his young mind shouldn't be having now, but he wanted to learn the answer before he actually became a shinobi. Before he had to do such things as spill another human's blood. The comparison to nature, though, were both scenarios really as different as he thought? Was he drawing lines between both too sharply? Because it wasn't entirely adding up. What if another bobcat killed the one he had seen in the forest? Just for a simple thing as one of the many rabbits that were so abundant in the entirety of the elemental nations? Would he even feel pity? Or would he just call it nature? The question itself was rhetorical. In this context, when compared to humans, it would just be nature. Murder. A legal term from definition, with the word meaning, the act of killing another being. Specifically, a human. However, that didn't mean that the same term couldn't be applied to anything else. The fact stayed the same with both. One kills, the other dies. But didn't change the fact that it was murder. Something that absolutely shouldn't and wouldn't be totally ignored, or become used to. Naruto stared down at the roadway he was walking, his thoughts clashing. He came to a conclusion, but it wasn't an answer yet. It was another set of questions. Why was everything so questionable? Was it just a matter of opinion? To say he cared about a random bobcat in the forest would be a lie. Why would he? The animal held no sentimental value or emotional attachment in his eyes. Animals died every day, but then again, so did people. So it was value in one over another? From these questions, he came up with his answer. Yes, that's exactly what it was. Flashback end. 6 days later. Week 7 of Shinobi Academy. 13 days after the Uchiha massacre. They were having a quiz, an activity this teacher liked to do very much. This was to Naruto's favor, as he actually didn't act biased towards him, and actually gave credit where it was due. Unlike Pond Scum and Mizuki Teme. This one may be a bit advanced for some of you. What are the most accessible vital blood pathways in the human body, leading to the quickest bleed-out time? Naruto raised his hand, and their anatomy teacher, a retired medic nin turned hospital surgeon, called on him. The brachial, jugular vein, and femoral. He answered simply, to which the man nodded. Most of the medically uninclined kids blinked. Correct. How about what organs are the most important to stay alive? Multiple hands went up at this. The question was rather easy. So easy, even Kiba knew it. You, Miss Yamanaka. The teacher called. The heart, brain, liver, lungs, and kidneys. She answered fluidly. The man nodded again, before glancing at the clock. Oh, look at the time. Okay then, you're dismissed to go back to your homeroom. Everyone immediately gathered their belongings and study books, and started filing out of the room. Naruto following behind with most of the slower kids. Like Choji and Shikamaru. Hey Naruto. The dull and lazy Shikamaru caught his attention. He gave the dark-haired boy a questioning look. Nobody ever really talked to him. What do you like so much about that class? He asked. Choji also wondered the same thing, even supplying his own words. Yeah, all of that jumbles up so much inside my head. How are you so good at it? Naruto tilted his head. I guess it's because I think it will be the most useful. I'm absolutely sure that I could survive without being able to recall the number of shinobi clans before the hidden villages formed. He informed. Shikamaru and Choji nodded. That makes sense. But all those complicated terms to remember. Oh yeah. Hey Shikamaru, did you ever get your dad too? And at that, Naruto was lost to the conversation. Not that he didn't expect it. Choji didn't seem to like being in his presence all that much, and Shikamaru looked to be completely neutral. Whatever. Anyway, more urgent things were on his mind. Being as their next lessons were something he dreaded beyond normal comprehension, secondary mathematics. 1. 3 hours later, Hajime, the moss green-haired Fukuro-sensei shouted out, initiating the spar between two students. Inazuka Kiba vs Haruno Sakura. Two heavy-hitting fighters, the latter being far more surprisingly so. No one expected the pink-haired civilian to rise up the ranks in taijutsu so quickly. Well, actually, it was less skill and more RAAGH, take this. That. Naruto sat under a tree, one of the few not taken by other students, and watched on, studying their moves quietly. The loud-mouthed dog versus the wailing rhinoceros, their classroom monikers. Neither were all that skilled, in his opinion. Kiba was fast, and that made up for his lack of skill. Sakura was slow, but, as he had overheard Pond Scum put it, hit like Mike Guy, whoever that was, on drugs. But yeah, it sounded about right. Every time she landed a solid on one of her opponents, it was almost impossible to stay in the ring. The only one who could do that was Choji. Fortunately, she had one critical weakness that everyone, except Kiba, who was determined to prove himself stronger purely in the physical department by tanking her punches, used to their advantage. She hardly ever blocked, and rarely kicked. If you could sneak one in, without getting smashed out of the arena due to her massive offensive capability, you could end it quickly. However, she always cried when someone hit her. A glass cannon, so everyone felt bad. But as some might say, no guts, no glory. Kiba had none of the guts that were so important to that equation, taking one right in the core, knocking the breath out of him. Even though he braced, he stumbled back at an astonishing pace. Right past the boundary line and onto his backside. Winner, Sakura, Fukuro-sensei announced, as Sakura stepped out of the arena throttling her fist and shouting. Shinero. 2. Next up, Kamurasaki Amy vs Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto stood up and brushed himself off. He watched his opponent flash the universal, loser, sign to Haruno, while she walked to the arena alongside him. Sakura was fuming in the background at the purple-haired girl's insult, as they stepped to opposite side of the ring. Ready? Pond Scum asked, to which both nodded, getting in their stances. Kamurasaki Amy, she didn't really specialize in anything taijutsu-wise. But she ruled book smarts to logic conversion. If she read it in a book, she could apply it to life just as easily. If Amy wasn't so bad in the physical areas such as what they were currently engaged in, other than bukajutsu, something she was pretty decent at, and her lack of teamwork, she would definitely get Kunoichi of the Year in this first year of the academy. Right now the most likely contender for that would be Yamanaka Ino. Naruto watched her stare him down with determination. They seemed to have become rivals without him noticing, over the past couple of days. He always did better than her in anatomy and chakra control, but it was the latter that made him enemy number 2, right before Ino and right after Sakura. That is, if the pink-haired girl even counted. Hajime. Amy immediately came at the fur-hatted blonde, throwing a punch, to which he sidestepped. Naruto then proceeded to step on her foot and use the backside of his arm to push her out of the arena. She tried to grab him to bring him down with her, but he let go of her foot just in time to avoid the swipe and for her to catch herself, foot outside the ring. Loser, Amy. Naruto didn't even bother getting irritated at the announcement. Amy just grumbled lowly and walked away. He simply walked back to his spot under the tree and sat down yet again, folding his arms behind his head. That was short. A few more matches passed by, nothing very interesting, and then it was time to head back inside to gather their belongings for the end of the day. Then they were off for break. 1 hour before. Jiraiya, I want you to take Naruto with you to find Tsunade. The Toad Sennin blinked at his sensei. He wanted him, one of the most, if not the most irresponsible adults this world has ever been graced with, along with being a best-selling smut author, to take an 8-year-old boy across Fire Country, in search of a woman he hadn't heard from in nearly 2 years? His response was what anyone in his position would have been. Are you going senile, sensei? Jiraiya asked flatly. Hirazen's eye twitched. No, I'm being quite serious. Naruto, to my knowledge, has no friends, no family, something you would know well about. This struck a chord in Jiraiya, and the man wasn't even done speaking. The only social contact he ever willingly initiates is with the Anbu. At this point, Hiruzen pretty much had his student played like a harp, but he still wasn't done. The finishing blow had yet to have been delivered. And all I'm asking of you is to take your godson on a less than week-long trip to find your, because she is, don't deny it, unacknowledged lover, in order to bring her back home so that I can retire from this damned position and die peacefully. Hopefully sometime within the next few years. The last part was said with utter seriousness. He's on break for the next 7 days. Jiraiya sighed. Well, when he put it like that. Now, Naruto stepped through the door to his apartment, and stared at the large-built white-haired man sitting in his living room. Who is he? The blonde decided to ignore the man for now. It had been a long day, he hadn't had lunch, and he was thirsty. The man kept staring at him, though, as he walked to his fridge. After a moment of silence with his hand on the door handle, he sighed and turned to address the very obvious problem. Who are you, and what exactly are you doing in my house? Jiraiya's sweat dropped. This kid, he needed to be educated. Jiraiya stood, struck a kabuki pose. What a grand question, kid. I am the gallant and handsome Jiraiya, the Toad Sennin of Mount Myoboku. Naruto was clearly not impressed. In fact, he looked several times more worn out than when he had first stepped through the door. Yeah, and? What are you doing in my house? Naruto repeated, violet blue eyes trained on the man. Jiraiya's eyes twitched. You're supposed to be impressed, kid. He grumbled. Jiraiya just noticed something. He quirked his eyes at the strange brown fur hat the kid wore. There was a discrepancy here. Kushina never wore a hat. Minato hated hats, and only wore the Hokage headdress when it was required. Why was the kid wearing a hat? He voiced his opinion on said head accessory. Kid, what's with the strange hat? Jiraiya questioned, rhetorically, while chuckling. Come on, no real shinobi wears a hat except for the Hokage. He walked forward and attempted to snatch the hat off of the blonde-haired boy's head, but was quickly stopped by the sight of a kunai being thrust towards his incoming limb. He quickly yanked it back with an unmanly squeak, lest he lose an appendage to a child barely a month and a half into his first year at the academy. Back off, weird old man. My hat. Naruto glared, his grip on the kunai not loosening. Again, what are you doing in my house? He was seriously running out of nerves. And losing brain cells. Jiraiya rolled his eyes. Look, the third told me to break you out of your shell. You and me are going out of the village. He gestured with his hand, to hunt down the next Hokage, my teammate Tsunade. Exciting, right? The white-haired man gave an exaggerated thumbs up, flashing bright white teeth. Naruto blinked. The old man Hokage sent him? Really? No thanks. The simple denial made Jiraiya's eye twitch again. The hell was up with this kid? When he was his age, he took any chance he could get to go outside the village. Come on, there'll be exotic shops, great sights, why women? Jiraiya paused. Who was he kidding? This kid was like 7. And candy. Naruto gave the man a deadpan stare. How old did this moron think he was? 5? Sorry, pervy pedophile, not interested. The Toad Sennin nearly screamed in horror. Pervy pedophile? Opening the door to the refrigerator and grabbing a jug of water, Naruto closed it. The blonde then walked over to a wooden chair he had, and plopped himself down in it. He popped the cap on the jug, and started to drink the cool water. After a moment of silence between the two, Naruto continued to try and persuade the man to leave. Now, if you wouldn't mind, please leave. Pawn scum assigned us homework over the break. Naruto requested him. Jiraiya blinked at the nickname the kid had given his teacher, then sighed, as he almost felt bad annoying him so much. No can do. Sensei would have my ear. Come on kid, gimme a break. You need the break? You're the one annoying me. The blonde grumbled. The Toad Sennin promptly ignored this statement. I can help you learn some new techniques. Naruto raised an eyebrow. What on earth could this guy possibly? Oh, right. This guy was supposedly one of the strongest shinobi in the Land of Fire. Easily forgotten. There was more silence as Naruto reevaluated, then contemplated the offer. Fine, I'll come with you. Naruto caved. Jiraiya yelled a silent victory in his head. On the condition that you teach me something useful. A smirk grew on the white-haired Senin's face. Oh, that's well within my capabilities. Jiraiya had already thought about this, and planned on teaching the kid something. The answer of what was rather obvious. Unknown area, same day. Hey, little girl. A slicked-back silver-haired man called out to a dark brown-haired teen girl sleeping on a tree-shaded bench. She opened her eyes and looked up at the man carrying the large red scythe. What do you want, asshole? She grumbled, irritated that her rest had been interrupted. I heard we got a new follower to the great Jashin-sama. I'm guessing you're it? The girl raised an eyebrow. How did the man even find her? Did he actually get an answer back in his prayers? She shrugged at the question. Technically she did follow most of the religion. Sure, he scowled at the lackadaisical response, the seeming disrespect to his worshipped god. What did you even do to earn his calling? Kill your little boyfriend? She let a ghost of a smile cross her lips. Naruto rubbed his temples under his hat. The brain cells, were dying by the multiples now. When he had said to teach me something useful, there was clearly a difference between his and Jiraiya's definition of the word. A very large difference. First off, he was 8. Not even out of the academy. No shinobi status whatsoever. He didn't even know any basic techniques other than the leaf-sticking exercise, let alone any actual attacks. And yet the man wanted to teach him this? How many academy students know how to perform rank techniques? If one answered, a minimal to negligible percentage, they would be correct. Naruto just stared at the white-haired Senin, unamused. When I said, useful, I had something else in mind. How is this going to help me? Jiraiya's jaw dropped. How could this kid not see this as useful? The spiraling blue orb of energy suspending over the man's hand, that had previously been driven through a tree, in order to demonstrate effectiveness, in which it destroyed said tree, fizzled out in a dispersal of chakra. Kid, this is the 4th Hokage's Rasengan. How could it not be useful? Naruto gave the man a deadpan expression. Oh, I don't know? Possibly because I'm only 8? I'm not even a genin yet. Teach me something that will help me. Like, for example, those surface walking techniques. Those are more my level, aren't they? Jiraiya frowned. He hadn't thought of that. That also meant that summoning was out of the question, didn't it? Damn it. Fine, kid, I'll start you on something simple. He picked up a recently fallen leaf off of the road, and handed it to the blonde child. Naruto raised a brow under his hat. A leaf? What exactly was this supposed to help him with? I want you to split it, straight down the middle. If it shreds or explodes, try it again. If you can complete that, I'll teach you something useful, the man directed, grumbling the last part. That should keep him busy for a while. There was no way the kid could split it all the way through, but it did increase control. Maybe he would teach him something like the Kawarimi if he managed to get something close to a clean cut. That was pretty handy. Naruto stared at the leaf in concentration. It was obviously some sort of chakra exercise. He was only decent with those, but this sounded easy enough. Cut the leaf. It immediately shred as soon as his chakra touched it. He blinked. Well, this might be a bit challenging. 4 hours later, they were finally coming upon another village. The sun was steadily dropping out the sky, giving way for the moon, and Naruto had been trying to split the leaf for all of about 3 hours between breaks during the walk. He liked a little challenge, but this was getting slightly ridiculous. As of yet, every time he picked one up, he had only managed to get the leaf to cut in half. It was a small victory, but it always crumpled after that point, so he couldn't declare a success towards the lecherous toad sage just yet. Although, he had run into a small problem. He had been stuck in a stalemate for the past 40 minutes. No progress was being made, unlike before. But the hatted blonde wouldn't give up just yet. However, the toad Senin had other plans. Hey kid, I'm going to meet a contact in order to help find Tsunade. Are you all good? Naruto waved his hand dismissively, and dropped the last of his gathered leaf supply. I'm fine, pervy frog-san. Jiraiya's eye twitched, annoyed. Toads not frogs. They're both amphibious, Naruto quipped, staring the man down. Yeah, well dugongs are mammals, too. Do we look like dugongs? The white-haired sage retorted in a rhetorical question, lightly glaring back at the boy. Many people on the streets were looking at the man strangely, probably wondering why he was bothering to argue with a child that looked to be less than a one-fifth his age and half his size, about frogs and toads. Naruto shrugged, point taken, pervy Toad-san. Then proceeded to adjust his hat. So where will I be while you're off meeting this contact? You will be waiting near, or in, the shop across the street. Buy something if you want, I don't care, but don't wander off or talk to any suspicious strangers. Jiraiya told him, pointing to what must have been the shop he was referring to. On the other side of the road, a little further down, was, as Naruto had already guessed, a gentleman's club. Yeah, he was definitely going in there to perv out. He shrugged his shoulders again. Perverts would be perverts. Naruto watched him walk to the entrance, turning back to glance at him, his eyes practically reading a warning out, to behave, then disappearing into the building. The blonde breathed a sigh, then made his way over to the lowly occupied shop. Please come again, he heard, and someone passed him in the entranceway. A brown-haired heavy-set man, who he guessed was the cashier, ignored him, and went back to the book he had been reading previously. Naruto started looking at the wares, having nothing else to do. They were wide in variety as it was a multi-purpose shop. Books, household supplies, cooking ingredients, and things of that nature lined the shelves. Since he didn't have any interest in the miscellaneous items, he went over to the bookshelves. It had a decent selection, nothing as good as the shops in Konoha, but that was to be expected. Naruto picked out a random book in which the title appealed to him, or read a few pages. It was named The Story of Waterlaw, about a pirate surgeon who could cut through anything with his scalpel's sharp blade. Cool. The genre was fiction, and one could tell it was such. For example, what was a submarine? The author described it as an enclosed ship that could move down below the water. Interesting and creative. He liked it, and it was rather cheaply priced. Picking out one of the less worn books from the back, he walked up to the cashier. Knocking on the counter, he placed the book down. The man looked up from his book, raising a brow. Do you have the money for this, young man? It was a question he got a lot. He held up the toad wallet, and the man nodded. 100 ryo please. Naruto already had the money in hand, giving it to the man to let him count it. When he was given the okay, he took his book, and stepped out of the shop to go to the small food bar next door. He was hungry. 15 minutes before, Jiraiya, contrary to what might have been believed, was not in fact going in there to give in to his manly urges. He was more adult than that, given the situation, and didn't want Naruto to be out there alone for too long. The boy, no matter how uneasy he was, still happened to be the child he was granted the title of godfather to by one of his favorite pupils. Sitting down in the back seat of the room he had purchased, he waited for his contact. He didn't have to wait long, as only a few minutes later a lightly curvaceous long-haired brunette opened the door. She was dressed in a short light green skirt, and a revealing black tie top. As she entered, she closed the door behind her, swaying her hips and coming over to sit on his lap. Hey handsome Tilda, what do you need in this fine establishment today? Jiraiya smirked perversely for a moment, but shook the expression off. This was important, his duty to Sarutobi-sensei. I need to know where a certain, dead-ridden blonde, happens to be. If you happen to know, Miss Izumi? He asked lowly, starting to massage the young woman's back. She hummed. Nothing about the blonde sennin's current location came to mind. The last she had heard from the traveling merchants in the network, the drunk gambler was somewhere in Tanzaku-gai, south of the small town they were in now, although, that was a few months ago. The blonde slug summoner tended to move around a lot. It was possible she was still there, but very unlikely. The latest I have is that she was in Tanzaku, that was in late autumn. I don't know where she could be now, though. She lowly groaned at the feeling of his hands. She wished the rest of her clients would do this more often. Working this job was a literal pain in the neck and back. Jiraiya sighed at the lack of information, but that was to be expected. This pretty much set his next destination to search for her. Hopefully she was still there. If not, maybe someone could have clues. That said, are you here for the usual company? Or are you on business? Izumi turned and asked, tilting her head in question. Jiraiya finished up his massage and frowned. Unfortunately, the third requested me to find her. You did hear about the Uchiha massacre, right? The brunette nodded. How could she not? The news swept like wind through the elemental nations. Most of the other hidden villages were more than likely celebrating about the tragedy. Yeah, well, the old man has finally slipped under the pressure of the villagers' demands to find and execute the killer. He wants me to find Tsunade to replace him. Jiraiya usually wasn't this loose-lipped, even to some of his closest of informants. The only reason he was telling the young woman was because it wasn't exactly important. It would become public within the month, anyway, as he would likely renounce his position far before they even returned with the woman. Azumi understood, and got up from the man's lap, turning around to give a respectful bow to him. "Well then, Mr. Jiraiya, I wish you luck, Tilda." She said her farewell, and with that, she exited the room. Jiraiya got up after watching the young woman leave. He often wondered why she worked as these kinds of places at all. She was too young, and he knew for a fact that she was smarter than most girls her age. She could even have potential to be a kunoichi. Though, he guessed that it was her decision to make. He made his way out of the room, then the building, dropping a few bills in the tip jar on his way out. Next morning, 8 a.m. Naruto was really getting irritated with these leaves. He was making progress, but it was so small that it was barely noticeable. He and Jiraiya had left the village a few hours ago, shortly after waking up, and he had been working on it since. They had rented a hotel room so that Naruto wouldn't be left to the night, and then Jiraiya went to talk to a few more of his informants just in case they had heard anything more. They didn't, so now they were heading south, to Tanzakugai, a large and very rich town with a long history of being somewhat of a gambling central. He applied chakra to another leaf. It split only a half of the way, and then stopped. Again. "Hey, pervy toad sage. I think this might be a little bit advanced for me." He dropped the leaf. Jiraiya looked over at him, and saw the annoyed expression on the boy's face. It made him chuckle. He remembered when Minato did the exercise. It was almost the same for him, except he was much older, and actually knew how to mold chakra decently well. "Of course it is. You think I would give you something easy? How far along have you come with it, anyway?" Naruto sighed. "Halfway." To this, the toad sage nodded. "A small nick, just like Minato." "Halfway." Jiraiya shouted in shock and disbelief. No, that shouldn't have been possible. Even Minato couldn't get it until he was around 14. "Yeah, look." Naruto took another leaf, and used his chakra to put a split in the leaf. The same as all the others. See, barely halfway through, the irritation was palpable. Jiraiya could barely believe his eyes. This was an elemental chakra exercise. An 8-year-old sure as hell shouldn't be able to do it. The hatted blonde suddenly stopped walking. A revelation was had. Why the heck was the man shouting out like he was in shock? "Pervy pedo, you sound surprised. Did you not expect me to be able to do it?" Naruto narrowed his eyes at the man, his violet-blue orbs locking onto the Sennin's own. "Well, not really. Maybe just a small nick," the man admitted, then screamed out when the blonde landed a kick straight up between the man's legs. The man keeled, then dropped to the floor holding his lower regions, and curling into the fetal position. "Why the hell would you give me it then, asshole?" Naruto hissed, even more irritated. "What, were you just going to stall me out on this until we could get back to the village?" he continued, glaring at the man who was gritting his teeth in pain on the dirt road. "No, that was just something meant to keep you occupied until I could figure out what to teach you," the man groaned, and Naruto's palm was introduced to his face. Seriously? The man was a Sennin. The kind that society claimed knew hundreds of techniques. He wasn't even asking for him to teach him some crazy elaborate jutsu. In fact, he didn't want one. Just something useful. Was that too much to ask? It turned out that leaf exercise was actually useful. In a small and semi-unhelpful way, as of now, for increasing the chakra flow and control in his hands. He couldn't really walk up any trees yet. He started working on that on his own, after he decided that the pervy toad wasn't exactly prime, or even good, teacher material. However, he could stick to them with his hands like an expert. Yet, as previously stated, that wasn't going to help him much at this point in time. Actually, that wasn't entirely true. It did serve one purpose. The hatted blonde attempted to run up the large oak tree yet again, making it up about 2.4 meters, 8 feet, before slipping off. He quickly grabbed the tree with his magnetic hands, then pulled the kunai that was stored in his shorts out, and carved a line marking his stopping point. This is what he had been doing for the past hour or so while Jiraiya prepared lunch. Naruto dropped to the ground, then backed off for another run. He sprinted at the tree again, hitting the base and making it up several more steps than before. Surprisingly so, he was making excellent progress. They were next headed for Tanzaku-gai, a few hours' walk southwest of their position. Speaking of the multi-hour walk in between destinations, the small town they were in previously, to where they stopped, was incredibly boring. His book had helped with such matters, to which he was thankful that he had purchased it. Jiraiya had tried making entertaining conversation, such as a long list of reasons why toads were better than frogs, and the like, although it was mostly ignored by the blonde, so that died out pretty quickly. Now they just listened to birds, and Jiraiya kept watch for bandits, which were quite a rarity in the land of fire, but still a problem nonetheless. "Hey kid, food's ready," he heard the sage inform him, and stopped before trying another attempt at the tree. Food was of slightly higher priority. Being hungry sucked. Naruto came over and sat down on the fallen log Jiraiya had found. The sage poured, then handed him a bowl of what looked like potato soup and he started to eat. It was much better than he expected. "So, kid," Jiraiya caught the blonde's attention. "I've been thinking, we obviously have our differences in styles of fighting and what we consider useful. So, since I did promise I would teach you something, the leaf thing doesn't count. I was wondering, what do you see as useful?" Naruto looked up from his bowl and stared at the man, locking eyes with him. He seemed to be willing to take an opinion into consideration, instead of just trying to have him learn some powerful jutsu. That was good. Well, if it worked and the man actually did have something he was ready to teach him, it would only turn in his favor. Naruto sighed. "Something that will help me stay alive, or improve myself." Jiraiya nodded along, understanding. The blonde continued, "I don't want anything flashy. While that blue sphere, the Rasengan, looked powerful and all, that would only get me killed if I didn't have any supplements to back it up. Not to mention that it's probably far too advanced for me. Basics first," he finished explaining, and Jiraiya blinked. He had known this already, but this kid was much smarter than he gave him credit for. Not normal by way of child standards. That should have been expected, though. Focusing back on the subject at hand, however, what would he teach the boy? It would have to be something he couldn't just learn through trial and error, such as what he was doing now. Jiraiya squinted at his soup. What did he have that fit those criteria? An idea came to him. Something so simple that he was hard-pressed to call it much of a technique. But it was perfect. Tanzaku-gai. Naruto and Jiraiya stepped through the town gates just as the sun was making its way out of the sky, and immediately saw a large castle at the southwestern side, directly in front of them. It was huge, the centerpiece of the town. They passed multiple people going into shops and whatnot, busy with their lives. The atmosphere was rich, telling one that the town spent much of its funds in keeping the place clean and of high quality. Naruto was in awe. Never had he seen a place quite like it. After all, Konoha didn't dedicate nearly as much to the appearance of the village compared to the quality of its shinobi. With good reason. The latter was far more important for a hidden village. Both males made their way down the streets, passing businesses and apartment complexes alike. They were apparently going to get a room to drop their stuff off, then go to meet another informant, as Jiraiya had told him. Also, since it was a normal business, he was allowed to come this time. As they walked, they looked around for available housing. Picking out a cheap hotel, they rented a room for the night. Dropping his stuff on the bed, Naruto checked himself over for anything he may need. Kunai, check. Hat, check. Wallet, check. He was good. "Okay, kid, when we go to meet this guy, Takayuki, just stay quiet. He might be a bit of a slimy asshole, but unfortunately those kinds of people are inevitable. Don't make eye contact for too long either. He gets paranoid really easily. Maybe even from a kid." Jiraiya said seriously. "I don't entirely trust him, but he's the one that all information flows through around here." Naruto nodded. He could do quiet. Stepping out of the room, Jiraiya locked the door with the key the desk manager had given him, and they made their way onto the streets yet again. It only took a few minutes before they turned down a rather crowded road, walking quite a ways before coming to a large casino and bar named the Big Fish. The name was extremely unoriginal, but neither commented. Stepping through the doors and into the building, immediately they were bombarded by the sight of all sorts of people at card tables, slot machines, roulette machines. If it existed, It was more than likely in this building and with someone playing to win big. The bar was all the way at the very back, to which both Jiraiya and Naruto started to make their way towards. They saw a average-sized, dark-haired man dressed in a black haori, red shirt, and dark pants off to the side talking to a group of 3 men and a woman. Jiraiya tapped his unknowing godson's shoulder and nudged his head towards the man almost unnoticeably. If he had to guess, it was silent for, "That's Takayuki, remember what I told you?" Naruto nodded, then gripped and adjusted his hat. Both approached the counter, and the man immediately looked over to them, more precisely, Jiraiya. Naruto watched the man cautiously, as he gestured toward the other people standing there to leave. The group stood from the stools and walked past them. Naruto almost missed the hand signals they were giving each other. He narrowed his violet-blue eyes ever so slightly. "Shinobi?" Jiraiya didn't seem to notice, as the white-haired man sat on one of the stools. Turning his head away from the man behind the counter, he simply stood next to the Sennin and watched the group of people leave. "Jiraiya, what an unexpected surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure, Tilda?" His voice was like a smooth talker's. "Liquid." Naruto turned his attention back towards the man, but heeded Jiraiya's warnings of avoiding eye contact. He simply sat at one of the bar stools, face low towards the counter. "Takayuki-san, it is nice to see you too. I need to call in a favor." The Toad Sage began, leaning forward. Takayuki gave a ghost of a frown, but again was all smiles. A change that wasn't missed. "Ah, how may I help you, then?" he questioned, putting on a false expression of confusion. It was like he already knew what they were here for, what information Jiraiya wanted. "I need to know where Tsunade Senju may be located, if you happen to know." "It's quite important." Takayuki gave an even smile, and shook his head. "I'm afraid I don't think that she is still in town. I do believe that she left a while ago." The man continued. "Perhaps you should check Tofika?" he suggested. "Lies," Naruto thought. Jiraiya was along the same line of thinking. It was eerily obvious. The white-haired sage sighed, his face etched into faux disappointment. "That's unfortunate. I was really hoping to be able to find her here." "Well, I apologize for the inconvenience. Now if you don't mind," the man gestured to the other occupants sitting at the bar. Jiraiya nodded in understanding. Getting out of their chairs, they made their way for the exit. They walked down the center aisle to the doors. Unbeknownst to them, 5 people watched the departure. Outside, he was lying. Naruto called it and Jiraiya scoffed. "Like a rug on the ground. Normally he isn't that compliant with information. I'm honestly surprised he didn't ask for money, as he usually does. He's as greedy as they come." "So does that mean that she's here? If so, what would be the point in lying?" The blonde questioned the validity of the man's dishonesty. "Unless he was just trying to get rid of us." "Exactly," Jiraiya confirmed, then sighed, and looked up in the sky. Night was breaking. "Let's get some food, then head back to the room. We'll search for Tsunade tomorrow. If she actually is here, then she wouldn't leave at this time anyway." Naruto nodded in agreement. They decided to stop at a small food stand for dinner. Sitting in the stools next to the bar, Jiraiya rung the service bell. It took a few moments and they heard the sound of metal being dropped, but eventually an old woman came out of the back. "Hello, how may I help you?" the woman asked, kindly, smiling. "Ah yes, I would like a beef kushiyaki and, one." Jiraiya looked over at his blonde traveling companion. Naruto gestured to have the same. "Oh, make that 2 of the kushiyaki please, with waters." He finished the order. The woman nodded, and went into the back to prepare their drinks and food. Everything was quiet for a few moments, until she came out with 2 glasses of water. She set them down in front of them, giving another smile, before returning to the back. For lack of a better subject to talk about, Naruto decided to converse about the events of the next day. "Where do we look for her tomorrow?" "Our best bet is casinos and bars. A lot like the one we just visited. There are a bunch of them here, and she's a betting fool," Jiraiya told the blonde boy, who was casually sipping at his drink. Sparse conversation was made until their food came out nearly 20 minutes later, when the woman came out of the back and set the beef and vegetables down for them to eat. "Thank you." They thanked the cook and proceeded to tuck into the food. The more the blonde ate, the more he felt, not satisfied, but rather, tired. Why would he? The thought, though sluggish, came to him quickly. It was poison. Jiraiya's face was the first to hit the table, Naruto's following soon after. Not a noise was made. The woman that prepared the food was no longer an old lady, but rather a young, dark blue-haired kunoichi. Unknown amount of time later. It was obvious that the poison should have lasted longer. It didn't. Naruto's eyes slowly opened. The light level in the dark forest was minimal, but squinting, he could make out 3 different figures, 2 men and a woman. He didn't move, or rather, he couldn't. There was rope binding his hands, 2 of which sounded like they were having an argument, the blue-haired woman on the losing side. The words came into focus. Couldn't possibly expect me to kill the kid? Like hell will I have some child's blood on my hands. He couldn't possibly be older than 8. The woman shouted to the 2 men, one of which looked apathetic towards the situation, while the other was the one in the heated argument. I don't care what your fucking conscience is telling you. We only need the damned toad sage alive for the reward. If you won't kill the brat, I will. The man finalized, and the woman turned away gritting her teeth. Fine, just do it quickly. I don't want to see it, she said, and walked away into the trees. Naruto watched as the man approached him and grabbed him by the shirt, dragging him behind another tree. He felt a small sword being placed to his throat, tipped down. Sorry kid, just business, he said before bringing the weapon up and slamming it down. That's what he had planned. It didn't happen like that. Naruto had less than a half second to think about how he would stay alive as the blade came down. Unfortunately, or very fortunately, his body acted far quicker. The blonde didn't scream when he broke his own left hand to get out of the binding. He also didn't scream when the short sword the man aimed to stab him with was driven through his arm, between his ulna and radius. The blood splattered across his blank face, staining it. If he were entirely there, he would have said that it hurt enough to want to make him go unconscious. However, he wasn't exactly entirely there. His left iris was blood red, his pupil slit. His right eye stayed the same, violet blue. Naruto kicked the man's lower leg out from under him in the same instance, forcing the man to drop. The heterochromatic-eyed boy slid the blade out of his arm while getting up, all in one swift movement. Then stabbed into the shocked shinobi's neck before the man had a chance to move. Help! He screamed before the blade penetrated. It ripped through his jugular. The blood sprayed. Naruto yanked the red-covered blade out of the neck, and swayed to the side. The previously apathetic man who had been sitting down in the clearing, rushed over, and widened his eyes in horror when he saw the scene. But where was the, "Hey guys, get the fuck over here. Someone killed." Squelch. The blade pierced another throat. Naruto dragged it out, letting the sanguine gush, and stumbled into the clearing. The blue-haired woman came back at the sound of her comrade's screams. She looked around for the killer, expecting another shinobi. Her eyes found only a boy covered in blood, and holding a blade. He stared at her from under his hat brim. His left arm hung limp and his red eye was practically glowing. She spotted the bodies of her comrades behind him, each with a sword wound. The woman stepped back slightly, shaking with fear overwhelming her features as the red eye bore into her very soul. Killing intent flooded the clearing. She drew her sword, ready to defend herself from this demon. She didn't need to. Naruto swayed, walking forward, going for his next kill, only for his energy to wane. The blonde lurched, and hit the ground on his knees. He fell forward before he could make another move. He was out, unconscious. The woman didn't have inhibitions about killing the child any longer. She ran forward, ready to drive her blade through his heart. A senbon flew out of the woods, pierced the back of her neck. The woman collapsed. The black-haired girl who threw it rushed to the boy's aid, seeing his wounds. Her palms started to glow green. Shizune attempted to flip the collapsed and bloodied boy over so that she could not only get a better look at any injuries, but also to give the boy easier access to air, as he was face down in the grass. His arm had been pierced through the center, hitting a few vein and arteries, namely the ulnar and median, which were what she was working on closing now, as he may bleed out if they were left alone. She was surprised by how fast they were closing, though. Usually it took several minutes to repair that kind of damage. His own chakra appeared to be doing it multiple times faster than her mystical palm technique. Once they had closed, she attempted to go further down his arm to heal his fractured trapezius and metacarpal, his hand. Attempted. Shizune was forced back when the same wakizashi the boy had been holding nearly slit her throat. The loose blood on the weapon flicked onto her neck, staining a path where the blade would have carved. Shizune's eyes widened. Was this boy the one that murdered those bandits? No, that couldn't. The boy's eyes were now open. Left, vermilion red. Right, violet blue. They hadn't changed. His expression was just as impassive as before he collapsed. Shizune was so mesmerized by the deep orbs of color that she almost didn't notice when he uneasily stood up and lunged for her weapon first. She stepped back out of reach again and pulled a row of senbon from her leather side pouch. She wasn't really a fan of fighting, and she certainly wasn't a fan of fighting children. However, this one in particular didn't seem to want to give her an option. He looked like he was in a trance of sorts. The blonde wasn't in his right mind. Naruto stepped forward and the short sword cut through the air towards her. Shizune stepped out of reach a second time and launched her senbon, but he unpredictably swayed away from the large needles. He sprinted at her, sandals scuffing the earth, his left arm still limp, and his right clutching the wakizashi with a white-knuckled grip. Swing, duck, lunge, sidestep. Shizune kicked out and tripped the boy on his next run, making him stumble forward and to the ground. She launched a fifth senbon at his neck in order to temporarily paralyze him. Naruto rolled out of the way and into a crouch. He lifted himself back off of the ground and went for her again. Realizing that the senbon wouldn't be able to hold off the incoming blade, the black-haired teen pulled a kunai from her pouch and blocked the short sword. Naruto pressed into the kunai, and just then, Shizune realized how insanely strong he was. She was struggling to keep the kunai up in defense, even with a second hand holding it. He went for a roundhouse kick to her side, to which she blocked with the back of her arm, jarring her bones. Seeing that his attack failed, he spun the opposite direction and sent a whirling slash at her neck again. Torpid, Naruto wasn't able to follow through with it. She kneed him in the stomach, sending him careening back towards the trees. Counting on the delay before he could recover again, she whipped a senbon towards him. It split the air as it soared towards him at high speeds, however it didn't land. He stuck his leg back to the ground, catching himself and digging his right heel into the grass, then used his blade to deflect it, as he began showing more coordinated movements in a hypersensory-like state. But he didn't let up in his attacks in the slightest. She hailed an array of sharp senbon towards the boy, yet he seemed to ignore human standards as his blade clashed with every single one in his path, scraping steel against steel as if the world was in slow motion. He stopped for a moment and swayed to the side, subconsciously correcting his footing, then ran for another slash. Until a fist collided with the top of his head, dropping him to the dirt. Lady Tsunade. This kid wasn't alone. The slug Sennin pointed over to the tree line, where a figure dressed in red was unconscious and bound. I'd bet he's with Jiraiya. Unknown amount of time later. Naruto heard arguing, not shouting or anything but raised voices going back and forth. Where was he? What happened? He opened his eyes and saw a black-haired figure standing next to a blonde-haired woman. He remembered the enemy nin that poisoned. Shit. Naruto was instantly up, ignoring the rampant soreness in his arm, and out of his lying state running for the door? Door, not trees? Wasn't he in a forest? Naruto. He heard the bickering stop and a familiar voice call out. The pervy toad sage? The blonde stopped himself from barging through the door. He turned his head towards the voice. The sage was standing there, untied and awake, with a small amount of worry etched on his features. Naruto felt himself pause. If they had been poisoned and captured by Nuke Nin, why were they both untied? Why weren't they dead, or in bindings? Unless they had been freed? But how? A wave of memories hit him like a cinder block. The stab in his arm, the hand, the sword, the blood. He had killed 2 people. Murdered them, without hesitation, remorse, or any second thoughts. He had slain 2 others. He hit the wooden floor breathing heavily, as every little detail came back, flooding his mind. However, an older thought re-emerged, and his air inhale and exhale rate slowed. They, the Nuke Nin, were enemies. It was a kill or be killed situation. No denying it. The sword that was about to pierce his throat. The man's face who hadn't cared if he was dead or alive. If it was a matter of live or die. Did he want to live? Was it worth the death of another? He hesitated with his answer. Not that it wasn't clear what it was, but he didn't want to admit it. Yes, it was. He wanted to live, not die. If that meant sending some stranger to hell, so be it. Lightning didn't rain down from the sky and smite him. He didn't burn from the inside out. No looks of disappointment or fear from other people. It felt like a heavy weight was lifted off his back. Kid, it's okay. We all have done it at one point or another. It's our life, we're shinobi. Jiraiya's words reinforced his thoughts. Naruto stood, quietly. Something else came to mind, though. What happened to put him in that state? He looked up at the people watching him, and stared at them. There were two additions. A rather buxom twin ponytailed blonde woman, who fit the exact description the pervy hermit had given him. And beside her was a black-haired female wearing a short dark purple-colored kimono lined with black, over fishnet, and held with a red obi. Which must be been Shizune, the slug Sennin's apprentice. And the same girl who he had attempted to bisect through the neck. I apologize for earlier, Miss Shizune. He bowed, the last part being more of a confirmation, to the girl, who blinked. She waved her hands dismissively in front of herself. It's fine. You seem to have been in some sort of trance, so it's not your fault. Neither of us got hurt. She trailed off, thinking of the two corpses she had seen, but shook her head. It was self-defense, and from what Jiraiya-sama had told her, it probably wasn't even his fault. Naruto nodded, and then turned to the other woman, who was staring at him intently. He fidgeted under her gaze, and seeing as she, in his opinion, anyway, looked to be expecting a little more of him, he straightened his hat and bowed again. Pleased to meet you. Tsunade-san, he greeted. There was no mistaking that this woman was, in fact, the slug Sennin. Jiraiya's eyebrow twitched in annoyance. Why did this kid treat her with respect but not him? Tsunade continued to stare at him, as if looking at an old photo. You? Jiraiya glanced over to her, and she caught the look and shook her head. Something that Naruto didn't miss, however, didn't comment. Yeah, you too, brat. Naruto remembered something, having to do with their purpose here in the first place. So, since we have found you, are we going back to Konoha now? He questioned, to which Tsunade's expression immediately turned sour. No, we are not. You two are. Naruto's fingers twitched and he swiveled his violet blues onto Jiraiya, who sighed. This argument was to be expected, but the woman was proving to be much more hard-headed than he had been ready for. She doesn't want the position, he explained, and Naruto blinked and narrowed his eyes. What did he mean, she doesn't want the position? This wasn't something someone just turned down. What exactly do you mean, lady? He stared at the woman, who was now petting a small pig, Taunton, if he remembered correctly. Simple. I'm not going back to Konoha, and I'm absolutely not becoming Hokage. She stated with an air of finality. The much younger blonde could now see why Jiraiya was so agitated. The finality was not enough for him. Well, why not? Naruto persisted, getting more of a grip on their situation, and more annoyed with each passing moment. He had originally thought that almost anyone would jump for the position. Apparently that wasn't true, because it's a fool's job. My brother and boyfriend died wasting their lives for that position. Almost everyone who goes into that position meets the Reaper prematurely. I don't want to be one of those people. Naruto could have commented that this woman was past maturity, but he had other thoughts on his mind. He did not come all the way out here in order to just turn around and head back. Hell, he didn't want to come at all. This was basically just insult to injury. This woman was the only other person besides the pervy toad sage, which would he mention, that he did not want running Konoha, and that other old man from the council, who was a creepy pragmatist, that were even considered valid for the position, according to said toad sage. The hatted blonde turned to Jiraiya, who seemed to almost shrink under the young boy's gaze. You mean to tell me, the old man wanted me, to come out here for this? Naruto questioned, his tone taking a dead-toned drop. Just for us to get rejected? A nod from the white-haired man was his confirmation. He had been on this same topic with the woman since the subject came up after Naruto had been decked into unconsciousness. Tsunade set Taunton down. Now that that's decided, why don't you both? Smack. Both Shizune and Jiraiya widened their eyes when Naruto's hand went across the slug Sennin's right cheek. It wasn't all that powerful or anything, but the point was made. The younger blonde didn't wait to watch the aftermath of his actions. Lady, you're pathetic, he plainly stated, without much emotion to his voice. As if it was just a simple fact. Tsunade stayed silent, staring at the boy in shock. I honestly wouldn't care about your decision, you know, except for the fact that this trip was essentially useless. But your sensei almost pleads with you to take the position from him. Who has dealt with it far longer than you've even thought about it, and you just turned his request down? Because some others have failed? I'm sure your brother and boyfriend would be really happy with that line of thought. Naruto played a dangerous guilt trip. Line. Everything was silent for a moment. Shizune, Jiraiya, Naruto, and even Taunton watched for her return. Tsunade tightened her fists, as if she was about to slam the younger blonde into next week. Yet it wasn't to be. She cracked, gritting her teeth, then sighed, releasing the anger-filled pressure before she could let her fury take hold. And sink her. Fine. Under one condition, the slug Sennin stated. Naruto somewhat expected this. Once a gambler, always a gambler. She smirked. Jiraiya told me something interesting. You know that leaf exercise? Complete it by tomorrow night, 12 o'clock. If you don't, you leave here unsuccessful. Well, if there was ever a more appropriate time to say it out loud, or mumble. Shit. The next morning, Naruto focused on the leaf. All to the leaf. Nothing but the leaf. It split, halfway. Then it crumpled. 249th try of the morning turned noon down. A bit less than 12 hours left until 12 o'clock, midnight. The blonde had been sitting under this tree since before 9 a.m., repeatedly performing the same task. He wasn't getting anywhere. Naruto dropped the half-split leaf, and picked up another. Again, he lost count where he had finally decided to take a break. The boy got up and stretched out, then adjusted his hat. The trick is to let your chakra slice through the leaf like wind. The pervy toad sage had added his words of wisdom, before telling the boy that he was going into town to have a talk with Takayuki. What was he doing wrong? Controlling the flow of chakra wasn't necessarily hard. Releasing the right amount of chakra wasn't hard. It was controlling its exit that was killing him. Its form exiting the body was obviously paramount to his success. But what was he looking for? He tried the wind thing, but it still resulted in the same split and crumpled leaf. Almost like it was the same thing he had been trying since the pervy toad sage had given it to him. Using his finger to twirl a kunai around in his hand, Naruto sighed and lay back on the branch of the tree. Seconds ticked by. The blonde hardened his kunai with the technique Jiraiya had taught him the previous day. It had only taken him about an hour to master. He could feel it become slightly heavier and denser, as the chakra flooded the space between atoms, connecting and strengthening, yet not interfering with material function. The ring continued to spin around his finger, bringing the blade with it. His mind blanked for a moment before getting back on topic. What am I missing? The question of the day, wasn't it? He pocketed the kunai and picked another leaf, then applied chakra. Split. Crumple. He repeated. Split. Crumple. Okay, so the split was what he was going for, obviously wind, but why did it crumple? Naruto could only feel himself getting more confused. Did it crumple because of an overload of chakra? Like a dull knife trying to cut through paper? Possible, but unlikely. He dropped to the ground from the branch. Maybe a walk would produce more spontaneous and helpful thoughts? His stomach growled. Food. That would be his first stop. Food stand, 12:35 p.m. Naruto stared at his food. At first he was cautious of poison, due to the events of yesterday, but he figured that the odds of that happening twice in 2 days were extremely low. He took a bite of his lunch, little breaded pork cutlets and vegetables. They were good. He ate his meal, thinking about his problem. To slice the leaf, his chakra would need to be sharp, like wind. That was what he had so far. Was it not sharp enough? How could he fix that? He had been working on that for ages now. No improvement yet. Was he thinking on the wrong problems? Naruto glanced at the napkin in front of him. A random thought occurred, like a dull knife through paper? If he could almost do it with a leaf, then paper would surely be much easier, right? Thinner and softer than a live oak leaf. The blonde picked up the paper square and held it flat, for fewer wrinkles. Focus. He could feel his chakra escape from his fingertips, forming the little stream of chakra that was meant to slice the napkin down the center. Except it didn't. Just like the leaf, the napkin started to crumple, but instead of ending there, this time it burst into flames. That was different. He quickly dropped the small flaming paper ball on the ground and stomped it out. Something was interfering, however it wasn't fire. That was just the side effect. Electricity? Was that his problem? It would make perfect sense. The crumpling and heating, which would result in said flames. If that was the problem, then how did he stop it? Could he separate his chakra, wind from lightning? That is, if he had either at all? Shinobi always had at least one affinity of the fire, wind, lightning, earth and water elemental natures, as he had read. They were mostly genetic, and it was possible to have two or even three, the latter being only in a few recorded cases throughout Konoha. Having two wasn't rare, though. It was very much a possibility that he had both, otherwise the leaf wouldn't split or crumple, curl. It would burn, or whatever it did when it came into contact with water or earth, if anything at all. Maybe that's why people used chakra paper instead. That brought another thought along with it. How did the pervy toad sage know he might have wind chakra? It was the rarest type of chakra in the land of fire. Naruto sighed. No, he would think on that later, although he did have a good theory that bugged him ever since the meeting with Tsunade. Right now, this was his more urgent task. He paid the bill for the food and started to head back to the tree. His goal, to separate wind from lightning. Skip, 11:14 p.m. Naruto walked into the restaurant, making his way down a column of tables and chairs. Stopping at a particular table, one that he was informed by the Toad Sennin, was the meeting place for his goal of completion. As the entire group would be there for the next hour, the blonde held out the leaf. All the eyes of that particular table were on him. He proceeded to promptly bisect it, down the middle, in twain. Setting the halves of the split leaf on the table in front of the slug Sennin, he thought over the last several hours. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was painfully, sinfully, hard. To separate wind and lightning, one having a weakness to the other, although he wasn't exactly sure if that played a factor or not, was awful. A process he would never want to repeat. But he had done it, miraculously, within the 11 hours he had left. Even without dinner, Tsunade and Shizune were shocked. Jiraiya simply chuckled. He adjusted his fur hat with one of his small, yet noticeable, rare, grins. His violet-blue eyes bore into the woman's own, through the shadow the hat placed on his face. Ready to come back to Konoha, Hokage-sama? Oh great Jashin-sama, please take this sacrifice in your name, a distinctly young female figure said, and proceeded to stab the half-dead missing nin in the heart. He convulsed, then fell back to the earth before the last of his life left his body. Amen. The dark brown-haired girl sighed and picked up her missing arm from the ground, reattaching it. These shinobi were such a pain to deal with. Especially this magma-spewing used-to-be rock lover. Damned Keke Genkai. Not that she could talk. This sacrificing thing wasn't working nearly as well out in the field. Or at least as often, as it had been in Konoha. Kills were so easy there, mostly because nobody expected to be brutally assassinated in the night, or during the day, in the middle of one of the most powerful shinobi villages. It was basically pick and choose. No one suspected a young girl. Popular assumptions were that the shinobi would protect them, obviously. And that was true most of the time. It was pretty funny when she went to torture them before killing them. They started spouting that she was a sick child, and would be executed for her actions, that the village wouldn't let their death go, and the shinobi would find out her identity and hunt her to the last breath. False. Not once had they even suspected her. They were always marked down as different murderers. Quite a few of her kills were credited to the Red Note killer, to where even though she didn't know how or why the name came about, it was still cool. This particular persona was thought to have died or left the village, as after the third known kill, out of about 10, her rate of efficiency started rising, leaving less tracks and less possible identification. However, back to the topic of ease. Out here, when shinobi, especially missing nin, which weren't all that rare in Yu no Kuni due to the lax nature of their hidden village, were on the move, they were on full guard. It sucked. Why the did Hidan want to come here, again? Oh right, the shrine. Hey, little bitch. Good to see you finished up. She twitched at the name, then flashed the silver-haired man the finger. No thanks to you, asshole. The melted portions of her legs were still healing, so it was a pain, both physically and mentally, to stand. A large amount of her weapons had also been marred beyond repair. Not good times. You need to learn how to deal with this stuff anyway, so shut it. He rebuked, then smirked, twirling his tri-blade scythe. We're moving. Can y'all even walk? She grimaced, shooting an annoyed glare at him. HN. Konohagakure no Sato. Flashback. I hereby nominate Tsunade Senju as the Godem Hokage. Here is an announce to the crowd of those who came to the promotion ceremony. He proceeded to place the Hokage's hat on the blonde woman's head. Sarutobi's decision had already been cleared by the Fire Daimyo, not that it would have really been denied anyway. If a previous Kage was the one electing the candidate, it was almost a guaranteed win. It had been around 2 days since they, Naruto, Jiraiya, Tsunade, Shizune, and Taunton, arrived back to Konoha. The village seemed to be quite anxious, pretty much confirming that the third had, in fact, announced his stepping down. A new Hokage wasn't exactly something that happened often, the shortest time between them being with the election of the fourth and then the re-election of the third. A lot of the citizens and shinobi would be worried, as a new one may come with different regulations, views on how the village should run, etc. It should be noted that the village was much more of a dictatorship than a democracy. The Hokage made all of the final decisions in large matters. If this new one decided that they just wanted to close the semi-peaceful, in other words, not completely hostile, communications with other villages and wage war on them, they could. Of course there would be extreme mutiny, along with an overthrowing of that particular Kage. But it very well could happen. That exact scenario had happened in Kirigakure, and now nearly all of Mizu no Kuni, Land of Water, was waging civil war. Too busy in their own problems to worry about the rest of the world. However, when the news was released that the possible Godem was announced to be the Slug Sennin, the citizens calmed. Many people respected the woman greatly, and saw her as a fine candidate. The only other person on the list of possibilities that was in the running, being Danzo Shimura, whose standing in the village paled in comparison to Tsunade Senju, the granddaughter of the village's founder, grandniece of the second, and student of the third. From that moment forth, there wasn't a doubt in anyone's mind that she would be the next, the fifth. After the announcement ceremony was completed, Jiraiya had bid the village goodbye once again, back on the roads and monitoring his intelligence network. Shizune had become the new Hokage's assistant. Tsunade, other than the obvious, had taken over the role of the head advisor of Konoha's main hospital, being the best-known doctor and medical nin in the village. Meanwhile, Naruto had gone back to daily life. Flashback end. Now, Naruto stared at the short sword in the blacksmith's small collection, contemplating its use for the foreseeable future. Its handle was wrapped in dark orange cloth, and it was made of dark matte steel, no polish, to prevent light reflectivity. After the events of Tanzaku Gai about a month ago, Naruto had been mulling over the use he would have in a sword. He had previously bought a bakken of the same length and light curve, and found it to be rather easy to use in practice. While he didn't have any sort of swordsman technique, he found his natural skill with the short medium-sized blade to be more than adequate. It wasn't like he was becoming a shinobi anytime soon, either. He still had over 3.5 years and change left until graduation. The blonde was honestly surprised by the sheer lack of experienced kenjutsu practitioners in the village of Konoha. There were about 6, nearly all of them Anbu. It was like it was being bred out of modern-day leaf shinobi. Possibly to make them more producible? But that wasn't a problem for him right now. Naruto was extremely surprised at how inexpensive the sword was. That's why it caught his attention. He had been coming to resupply on Kanai, and his eyes had been drawn to it because of the lack of digits noting its price. It didn't look bad quality at all, the steel was nice, and the blade looked well crafted. Could do with a sharpening though, because to be honest, it only looked about sharp enough to cut butter, and that was all it could cut. It was affordable, and looked to be well worth the amount. He took it and its basic black sheath off the rack and over to the counter, setting it down in front of the slightly over middle-aged woman. She blinked at the object that had been put in front of her. A sword that had been in stock for a while, but not more than a year or two, that her husband made, but was never bought. Wakizashi weren't very popular with people. Either they wanted a full-length blade or a short one. Looking up slightly to the one who had brought it up to the counter, she quirked an eyebrow. "Child, you do know that very few people in this village would be willing to teach, you, sword arts, correct? Are you sure that you wouldn't like something more like a tanto?" She said the first part slowly and gestured to another rack, lined with the more frequently used type of blade. Easier to wield, learn, and they were competitively priced. Naruto had tried them out, held them, and performed basic motions, but they weren't quite the same. Not long enough for him to waste money on one over a standard kunai. They may have been good for some people, but he was looking for something with a bit more reach. The blonde shook his head and handed her the amount. It may be enough money lost to have him go hungry for an entire month, but this was what his savings were for. By this class of weapons standards, thing was almost dirt cheap in comparison. Where would he find something like it again? The woman sighed, yet rung it up anyway. Handing him back the sword, she turned her head to the door hearing the bell and saw her granddaughter walking in the shop. She looked like she was beaten into the ground, as she did every time she went out to train. Her twin hair buns were unfurling, and there were heavy sweat stains on her clothes. Naruto gave her a flicker of a glance and she did the same to him. He continued to walk past her and out of the door, kunai restocked and newly acquired weapon in hand. The girl, Tenten, turned to her grandmother once he left. Who was that? Tenten looked up at her grandmother. It was strange for a first year to be buying a sword. She was one of the only ones in the entire academy to even use any weapons. Not to say that weapons weren't used, but it was just uncommon. She had seen that particular kid multiple times. He was the only shinobi in training to wear such a weird hat. Never had she heard his name, though. He seemed to be a bit of a taboo subject amongst the students. That boy, he's special. Tenten looked confused at her grandmother's logic. Special? What was so different about him, besides the obvious? Training ground. Naruto unsheathed his sword and gave it a few test swings. Strangely enough, it was a bit light for his tastes, but other than that, perfect. The reach felt good enough, but it wasn't so as hinder him despite his shortage on height. The guard was simple, being a simple small rectangle, and the pommel was just a metal cap. He flipped it around in his hand, changing grips from over and underhanded. Settling on over, the blonde got in a stance and imagined a dummy opponent in front of him. Naruto tentatively thrusted it forward, then yanked it back and proceeded to step into a wide neck slash. He switched to underhand, next stabbing and pulling out, followed by a knee to the gut and a hammer kick into the imaginary ribs. He sheathed the sword yet again. The hatted blonde tried to be as fluid as possible with his movement. That's what they were taught in the academy, was key. It seemed to work well enough when it came to swords, then again, he couldn't possibly see why it wouldn't. Naruto stepped back and hummed. Awesome. The next day, academy. The ninjutsu, genjutsu period, or more appropriately, the chakra control period. They didn't actually get to learn any real techniques until the second, borderline third year. Most of the academy techniques were too advanced for the majority of the kids, even if they were only E rank. This was another point in which he excelled in his class, but less for the reason that he actually enjoyed it at all. More of it was that he was just good at it. Better than most of his classmates, much to the instructor's annoyance. They were currently learning to flush their chakra systems, mostly to clear genjutsu, but with a secondary effect of building enough control to be able to do it in the first place. A select few of his classmates, 9 of the 27, which included him, had already completed the exercise, able to break the light and harmless genjutsu placed on them. Most of this group was scattered along the training yard, talking. Naruto was lying against his usual tree, sleeping, as they still had most of the class left until the academy day was over. His light sleep was interrupted by a certain purple-haired girl glaring into his skull. Somehow, he was able to sense it. His eyes opened and he glanced over to the owner of the dark purple hair. Amy quickly looked away, to which Naruto blinked. Why exactly was she staring at him like that? It was even worse than usual. He knew that she was envious of him in most aspects, but did she really need to be so blatant in expressing her discontent? Was she just that jealous? He sighed and turned his head back. The moment he looked away, she was staring again, making him twitch. Naruto turned his sight to her again, to which she looked away again, and then rotated his head back, acting as if he hadn't seen her. Fooling her, and as such she went back to staring, glaring at him. Only to meet Naruto Uzumaki's dull violet-blue eyes. She flinched, this time snapping her neck back, so fast he might have actually been worried she might break it, to its original forward-watching position, and actually moving out of his line of sight. Whatever. Naruto shrugged, deciding that he honestly didn't care about her insecurities, and adjusted his hat. Pond Scum Sensei then announced the ending of the class and academy day. Okay class, it's nearly 2 o'clock. Time to grab your belongings, after that, you're dismissed. Naruto picked himself off from the tree, and made his way down the hall towards their class's room along with the small mass of other students. He gathered his bag and notebook from his desk, and walked out of the class and then to the main doors at the entrance. The blonde would have exited the building with the rest of the students being released. However, a hand grabbed onto his shirt and pulled him into an empty classroom. He briefly heard the door being shut. The hatted boy caught his footing and almost stabbed his purple-haired classmate with the kunai he had pulled from his shorts on reflex. It was Komurasaki Amy. The blonde blinked and quickly pulled the weapon from the neck of his kidnapper, who looked frightened. "What do you want?" He lightly tilted his head in questioning, raising an eyebrow. Amy collected herself. She was a shinobi in training after all, and grit her teeth. "You already know why, bastard." Naruto had never heard her curse before, but simply rolled with it. "Are you referring to the reason you keep glaring at me?" The purple-haired girl twitched in annoyance, and tightened her fists in anger. "Yeah, well kinda, I mean." She spouted but shook her head, regaining focus. "How do you know all that extra stuff like all those clan kids? How are you so good? What makes you so different from the rest of us? You're not from any special family. Actually, Tilda, aren't you an orphan?" She stopped in her rant, widening her eyes and freezing at that last part, cursing herself for being so insensitive. Amy was silent for a moment. "Sorry," she added, but Naruto shook his head. He had never desired parents, so the unintended insult didn't matter to him all that much. "It's fine, I don't care. But what exactly do you mean? This?" The hatted blonde grabbed the kunai from his shorts pocket again, and spun it around his finger while hardening it, making it turn darker in color. This was something he kind of started doing as a habit. If this was what she was talking about, Naruto was surprised that she noticed it at all. The change was so small. "Yeah, that." She stared at it, seeing it up close for the first time. "I read about it, chakra hardening. How did you even learn that?" Well, he wouldn't lie to her. "An amphibious pervert taught it to me." Amy immediately lost her anger, and blinked at him, not expecting that answer. She was silent for a minute. "Wait, what? Elaborate?" Naruto sighed again. "A perverted toad hermit taught it to me. We made an agreement. Now, if that's all." He rolled his neck and adjusted his hat, then walked out the door, effectively ending the conversation and leaving a very confused Amy still contemplating the meaning of amphibious perverted hermit. The blonde didn't plan on being there when she may have figured it out. Why was he even chosen to go on that trip in the first place? There was no way it was just to break him out of his shell. That's all for now. If you enjoyed, then please like, share and do comments.